Morning. I'm happy to be here. I wasn't sure when the brother invited me what I should actually speak about. But he had said now, well, you can make your reflections on black theology and black power within the South African context, as well as within the broader context of our discussion. Now, I've asked the organizers to put this portrait or this picture behind us, because I think for those who have doubted the impact of the Black Power movement, at least outside of America, I think there's a clear evidence here that it really sparked something here in South Africa. Now, we don't refer to it as South Africa, we refer to it as Azania. And often what we usually would say before we start all these things is to say one Azania, one nation. One Azania, one nation. One Azania, one nation. Yes, that's how it goes. So this portrait actually is related to the event that took place in 1976 in Soweto, the Soweto uprising. It's actually the students that painted that graffiti that you see there. So really the impact of Black Power cannot be avoided. So I've titled my presentation, Black Liberation Theology Remains a Formidable Theology. By way of abstract, I point out that the subject of Black Liberation Theology in occupied Azania is a remarkable development of the work of the Black consciousness movement's philosophy and the effect of Black Power in the world. Black Liberation Theology changed the lenses, the hermeneutics, the praxis of the church and believers in confronting the bastardization and vulgarization of the true gospel by the so-called white Christians. Black Liberation Theology remains the existential revelation of God to the church, given seemingly perpetuity of white racism and the capitalistic mode of production. This reflection unveils the great work ahead, which remains undone not only in Azania, but in the world at large. The thesis of this reflection is that Black Liberation Theology, as is the case for Black Liberation Theology or for liberation theologies, is in fact a way of doing theology propelled by agency and praxis. Black Liberation Theology and liberal theologies and liberation theologies across the spectrum remains needing to meet out their logical conclusions, namely liberation. Now, of course, one cannot avoid the crossing of the paths when reflecting about the history of Black Liberation Theology and how it will also play out here in Azania. I'm not really that sophisticated. It's the first time I'm actually using a laptop to present. Often I print my presentation, so bear with me. Black Liberation Theology is a product of the 1960s. It is a theological framework influenced by African slaves at the shores of the Cape Coast, the spirituals with their eschatological drive towards liberation on earth, which is a decoded theme in their blues, where they speak about otherworldliness when in fact referring to the existential crisis that is facing black people in the world. At least that we learn from Cole. Black Liberation Theology is influenced by the black church, which developed a distinguished form of African Christianity and the mystery of being a unique institution at the time, characterized by namelessness and invisibility in the United States. Now, one can make an argument that the same is true in the South African context. It's just that now we're trying to go to the archives to see how this form of Christianity actually existed. Black Liberation Theology, of course, is influenced by the likes of Malcolm X, the figure who Cone defined for us as the blackness in us, the kind of man who teaches us that we don't like white people messing with us. At the same time, it is influenced by the likes of Martin Luther King, who in some sense is our conscience to our call of being Christians, our Christian vocation, and carrying out our cross in the world. Finally, Black Liberation Theology is influenced by the call of Black Power, the Black Power movement in the United States. James Cone's text, Black Theology and Black Power, published in 1969, is the first text, at least on the academic level, to advocate for black theology within the discipline of Christian dogmatics, simultaneously providing its methodology, hermeneutics, and praxis. However, it is accepted that before its inscription in the book written by Cone, black liberation theology has always existed in how black people have engaged with the biblical text, understanding the biblical text, as well as their own context. And this is true for those abroad as well as for those within the continent. And of course, in the diaspora, you've got seminal thinkers such as McNeil Taylor, who wrote God is a Negro, Henry Garnett. You've got revolutionaries such as Dan McVasey, Ned the Prophet Turner, as well as Marcus Mosiah Garvey. One cannot ignore that. In South Africa, black liberation theology was championed by the Black Consciousness movement under the influence of the Black Power movement or Black Power philosophy. Steve Biko was among the key leaders, as well as the role that was played by liberated spaces of ideas created by the University Christian movement, as well as the student Christian movement in institutions of higher learning. So this is very critical because often at times when we talk about the Black Consciousness movement, we miss this critical point that in fact before the formation of the Black Consciousness movement, the space that was provided to us by the University Christian movement is the one that actually made comrades to get familiar with books such as Black Theology and Black Power, as well as the work of the likes of Gutierrez and others. So it's very much important that we remember that. And while this may not be related to my presentation now, the South African Christian movement, often at times, very little of research has been done about it. There's a document they produced in the 1970s, I think around about 1976 or 7 if I'm not mistaken, called the Kairos document. Now, of course, I know most of you know about the Kairos document that was produced in the late 1980s and so on. If you were to compare the two, you're going to see a very sharp difference between what the Kairos document says and what the Kairos document says. And part of it is that the student Christian movement was far more radical than the Kairos document. In fact, they posited very clearly at the time that the South African government was not just a racist government, it was demonic, it was diabolical, it needed to be destroyed. So the language was very clear in terms of what the comrades understood their Christian duty being. And it's very interesting because the student Christian movement was a blending of both white students as well as black students. And the response from white students is also quite interesting because unlike the normal behavior of whites when it comes to black people, always attempting to correct us, to tell us to be cool, calm, they actually affirmed the position that was being articulated by the student Christian movement, in particular the black section of the student Christian movement. So I thought that is also important. So those spaces created sort of like the womb for the formation of black consciousness movement, as well as how the black consciousness movement would actually champion black liberation theology. Black liberation theology sought to merge the value of this dogmatic truth, the doctrines of Christianity, and the reality of the black experience and faith under white supremacy. In short, it sought to understand the role of God for those who are oppressed through race, class, and the legacies of white supremacy. And today we will add also the questions around gender. Cohn had argued our theology must merge consciously from an investigation of the socio-religious experience of black people, as that experience is reflected in black stories of God dealing with black people in the struggle for freedom. Similarly, a similar point is stressed out by Tagata Mofokeng when he speaks about the Bible and the response of black Christians when they read the Bible, saying that in some sense, as a way of coping, as a way of understanding what the Bible meant to them, black people in South Africa, when they read the Bible, when they read the stories, they realized that those stories were in fact about them. And it was automatic for the kind of black liberation theory that would come and grab hold of the church, the black churches in particular. So there's always a merging between what this text presents to us as the revelation and the deep pertinence of us having to pay attention to the existential situation that we find ourselves in. Black theology sought to equip blacks to reinterpret and view the scriptures, God and Christ, in light of their experiences, which seemed to be ignored by traditional Christianity that was taught by white churches. The importance of black power cannot be ignored because black power spelled out a significant change in the lives of black people, beginning with calling ourselves black and rejecting being called coloreds, Bantus, Negroes, and non-whites. Now, it's very much important for me to say this, that in the black consciousness movement, and this I will touch on also later, in the black consciousness movement, the idea or the term black has to be understood within the context of what is understood as group politics. Biko had observed, together with the black consciousness movement, that the success of white supremacy is that whites move as a collective group when they oppress us. Yes. Now, you had a situation here in Azania, you had the so-called Indians who came as indentured slaves to come and work here by the Europeans at the same time. Then you had a group which you would call coloreds. And now the colors were I don't want to use this word, I'll just put it, the product of white and black mating together. But you and I know, at a fundamental level, it's a rape beyond anything. Yes. So you had a situation where you had this colored group, then you had the so-called Bantus. Now, what the apartheid regime has successfully managed to do was to say, well, we're going to categorize society. We're going to have the first group, which is us, the Boers, the whites, and everybody else. The second group will give to the Indian and the so-called colored. The third group will give to the so-called Bantus. And that is how they were able to maintain power for the longest period. That's until the black consciousness philosophy emerged. And Biko made an argument. He said, well, if you are in the second group, your existence as well as our existence when the third group does not rely on us. It relies on the benevolence of the one who gives privilege. So the privileged givers will ascribe today a section for you as the second class. And if you do something, they might take that right away from you and give it to us. So therefore, there was a need for that group to collapse on both sides, the Bantus as well as the so-called Indian. And that is how you had then the conception and the idea of being black coming to the fore. So when we talk about black in the black consciousness sense, because we also have to make those distinctions. In this country, though there are fellow sister organizations such as the PAC, there was a lot of war around us having to call ourselves black. There was a strong insistence that we shouldn't call ourselves black, we should call ourselves Africans, because that's what we are. But the black consciousness movement understood that to be very narrow. That yes, it sounds very nice at the end of the day, but on a fundamental level, it will not change anything. And in fact, it's quite limiting because it can only speak for those in Africa and those in the African diaspora. But it will not be able to speak for the Aboriginals in Australia. It will not be able to speak for those of the same pigmentation as us, who don't necessarily have to call themselves African, but are black people. And therefore, this was the approach that was taken by the black consciousness movement, that we move as a collective group to advance against an enemy that is oppressing us as a collective group. They don't say that they are Jews, they don't say that they are Italians, they don't say that they are this and that. They move as one group. And therefore, our premise should be that we move as one collective group. This was the understanding of the time. So, we rejected this naming and all these categories. In fact, the argument presented by the black consciousness for the insistence of being called black as opposed to non-white was firstly the rejection of whiteness being the barometer of existence. Secondly, this non-white meant a relegated state of being in the world, which is an attempt to grab on to the being which is white actually, and which actually makes it very impossible for those who are non-white to ever be beings in the first place. Another one which was made, which was the strongest argument, was that lastly, you don't call a donkey a non-horse. You call it a donkey. So you're not going to call us non-white, you're going to call us black. Yes. There was an insistence on that. So we have decided to call ourselves black for those reasons. Furthermore, it is critical to note that black power crossed beyond denominational lines, religions, culture, and so forth. This is, of course, clear for us in black liberation theology in the way in which we marry together Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. Malcolm coming from this Muslim perspective, and Martin Luther King coming from this Christian perspective. So we are able to marry the two. But even more importantly, on an international scale, in 1967, Stokely Carmichael went to Cuba as part of him having to clarify the meaning of Black Power and of the meaning of Black Power in the Third World. He met up with Fidel Castro, who explained that the oppression, the colonialism, the imperialism, and the capitalism, in fact, operates differently in every varying context. This trip is important because it affirms that Black Power was an international movement, partly distilled and distinguished from Pan-Africanism that addressed concerns of Africa in the continent and diaspora. Therefore, one cannot speak, which therefore could not speak for Aboriginals as well as others, and also people of African descent or people that are Black who find themselves in places other than Africa without the impact of the transatlantic slave trade. This realization of Black Power being an international movement was true in the thinking of the Black Consciousness movement. The South African Student Organization, SASO, which is the first Black Consciousness group, asserted, we have, in their manifesto they asserted, we have in our policy manifesto defined Blacks as those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, and socially discriminated against as a group in South Africa, in the South African society, and identifying themselves as a unit in the struggle towards the realization of their aspiration. This definition illustrates to us a number of things. One, being Black is not a matter of pigmentation, but being Black is a reflection of the mental attitude. Merely by describing yourself as Black, you have started on the road towards emancipation. You have committed yourself to fight against all forces that seek to use your Blackness as a stamp that marks you out as a subservient being. Mm-hmm. It is important to assert that this analysis must not mean that whites could pass as Blacks, but quite the opposite also. But also had the opposite effect even to the so-called Indian, so-called Khaled, and so-called Batu, who also could not automatically pass for being Black, because you needed to understand the enormity of what it means to be Black within the framework of the Black Consciousness movement. Furthermore, the definition of Blackness was also similar to what Cohn was also talking about in his analysis of making the distinction between physiological Blackness and ontological Blackness that may at times not be congruent with either physiology or ontology, especially within the political framework. Blackness in this form was a historical dialectical process, and Blackness contained a teleological trajectory for the oppressed, beginning with naming ourselves and defining ourselves. It is important to note that SASO was deeply influenced by the Black Power movement, but more importantly, by Black liberation theology, as espoused by Cohn, especially noting that in the manifesto, they also adopted Luke chapter 4, which, of course, tells us the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and so on and so forth. So there's this close relationship between the Black Consciousness movement and Black liberation theology. Therefore, there is no Black liberation theology in Azania without the Black consciousness. And this is clearly seen in the emergence of the UDF and contextual theology. Now, one has to point out that part of how the regime responded to us, especially the impact of the Black consciousness movement, was that some of the guys who were the leading figures within the Black consciousness movement were either scared or coerced to change tune. And part of them, in changing tune, they later formed what we know as UDF, the United Democratic Front, right? They formed UDF. And part of what UDF also did in terms of the theological landscape was to come up with what we know as contextual theology. So your contextual theology is the one that produced for us the Kairos document. But Black theology and Black consciousness produced the Kaira document. So there's a distinction between the two. So one has to make that point because people think today there is Black theology without Black consciousness. You cannot have any other way. You have to have the two together. They complete each other as a syllogism of some form. You have to have them both at the same time. Maybe it's significant to note that the emergence of Black Power also in June 16, 1966 in Mississippi would a decade later appear and reign in Soweto, June 16, 1976, with the Soweto uprising with students who engaged the army with sticks and stones, rallying around a black clenched fist and sloganing "Black Power, Black Power, Black Power." Now, one also has to add on this that if you are a spiritualist, I suppose, it would be very significant that 10 years later, on the same exact date, Black Power would ring in Soweto. Because of course it rang June 16, 1966 in Mississippi, and it also rang this side, 1976, June 16 in Soweto. And part of the influence and part of the strength of this Black Power movement is that everybody could identify with it. One of the leaders who led the Soweto uprising, Tsietsi Mashinini, tells the story that there was this young girl, I think she was about 8 or so, who, upon seeing the hippo, which used to be those big trucks that the police would come with, upon seeing the hippo and understanding the moment and what was happening in the country, that young child lifted up her clenched fist and said, "Power, power, power." And the police riddled that child with bullets. When he went the following day to go check on the bodies that were now lining up, you could see that young child. But the point is that the impact of Black Power had organized everybody in the black community. Of course, maybe the black kids did not know in terms of the ideological orientation in the deep sense, but they all could identify that Rona re batla power. And when they say Rona re batla power, they say we want power. We know these guys who are moving around here in Soweto saying power, power. We've seen the face. So it had that totalizing effect in terms of the response of black people responding against the enemy. At the same time, a year later, it must be remembered that in 1975, December, Kenny Rashidi, a BC stalwart who was elected unbeknown to them as well, would actually be the last president of the BPC, the Black People's Convention. And at the end of his inauguration speech in 1975, Comrade Kenny Rashidi led the movement into the black communities with shout songs of Black Power, the clenched fist, and the struggle song. So it had a deep impact in the black community. Actually, during the SASO BBC trial, among the evidence presented to the judge was actually the work that has been presented, work that has been written on the subject of black liberation theology. And some of the guys would present this to the judge and say, these guys believe that Jesus is a revolutionary. He's probably part of the Essenes. In fact, he had a zealot among his group, because I think they wanted to drive the point to the church to understand that even this figure who we are galvanizing ourselves and are surrounding ourselves comes from this particular situation where there's always the persistence of oppression and the response from those who are oppressed. So it was presented. So that is why I'll insist that there is no black theology in Azania without the black consciousness movement. You have to marry the two, whether you like it or not. And if you can't, tough. It is important to know that the black consciousness movement, it's important to note what the black consciousness movement did here in Azania was in fact a mirror image of what the Black Panther Party was doing in America. Save the fact that the Panthers perhaps were not really church-oriented in the same way that the Black Consciousness movement was. But I watched one interview of Huey who pointed out that perhaps that was our biggest mistake, given the fact that the church is one of the oldest institutions that we have as black people in the United States. So there's something that the Black Consciousness movement that was able to do, which perhaps the Panthers could not do at that particular moment in time. But you can see that ultimately they were mirroring each other in one way or another. Therefore, the Black Consciousness movement understood black liberation theology as its ecclesiastical arm in the fight for liberation. Biko argues, black theology at length, let it suffice to say that it seeks to relate God and Christ once more to the black man and his daily problems. It wants to describe Christ as a fighting God, not a passive God who allows a lie to rest unchallenged. It grapples with existential problems and does not claim to be a theology of absolute. It seeks to bring back God to the black man and to the truth and the reality of his situation. He further argues The time has come for our theologians to take up the cudgels of the fight of restoration and restoring meaning and direction in the black man's understanding of God. No nation can win a battle without faith, and if our faith in our God is spoiled by having to see him through the eyes of the same people we are fighting against, then obviously something begins, someone can say that something has gone wrong with that relationship. Finally, I would like to remind the black ministry, and indeed all black people, that God is not in the habit of coming down from heaven to solve people's problems. Black liberation theology historically and currently provided this new landscape to thinking about God, Christ, faith, and liberation, which merges with a new call and framework of tilting the scale, making sure that the oppressor gets what is due to him. Therefore, the role of faith was inseparable to the ambience of concrete reality. Faith was not there to make us escape the world, but instead to boldly confront it. Biko asserts no nation can win a battle without faith, and especially given the fact that if that faith is then spoiled by how we understand God, we have a serious problem. But in another place he argues, material want is bad enough, coupled with spiritual poverty, it kills. And this latter effect is probably the one that creates a mountain of obstacle in the normal course of emancipation of black people, end quote. It is then clear that for BC, the Black Consciousness Movement, Black Power, as well as Black Liberation Theology, which used that to operate, are in fact a link between the arm and the leg and the body as well. So there is a totaling effect in how we engage in the struggle. Scholars have demonstrated that in fact Sunday is the most racist hour, as you would see the separation between the color divide. Whites worshipping with whites in white areas and blacks worshipping with blacks in black areas. This logic unfortunately still holds true today. However, for the black church, I think it is necessary in order to experience soteriology differently from the white church. A soteriology that is twofold, namely physiological as Imago Dei and ontological as Imago Dei. A process that affirms their humanity, their legitimacy in terms of their place in the world, which is congruent with the goals of liberation. Traditionally, Black liberation theology, as well as Black liberation theologians, have acknowledged the two layers in Black liberation theology, which is the priestly and the prophetic. The priestly pertains to the liturgical aspects, the sacraments, the worship, the doxology, the preaching, whereas the prophetic is an action of speaking and acting truth to power, similar to the Old Testament prophets who go against the grain to proclaim against empires, oppressors, puppet regimes, the oppression and exploitation of the poor, and the orientation of worship to mammon. Certainly, the Latin American theologians have instilled the prophetic in the liturgical, by some refusing to administer sacraments of the Eucharist. Now, I once read an article where a particular bishop or priest in Latin America, when the time came for them to serve Holy Communion, he actually refused to do so in his church, based on the fact that the bread that was going to be consumed had been produced by the hands of the peasants who are now in church. He refused to also continue with the fruit of the vine because it is their hands that had produced it, but yet they are alienated from their production, they are alienated from their resources. So in some sense, I think this direction obviously will force the church to speak very differently about some of the things that they also believe in. When you sit and you think and you ask yourself, whose bread am I eating? Who has produced this bread? Who has produced the fruit of the vine? Perhaps our relationship with God will change and the revelation of the God of the oppressed will appear to us. So, in considering all those things, clearly what the Latin liberation theologians have shown us is that liberation theology, Black liberation theology, cannot avoid being political in the real sense of being political. Therefore, we also have to ask ourselves or wrestle with some questions as theologians, especially as it comes to our oppression. We have to ask as to whether there is validity in our case of the whole notion of a theodicy, given what Biko has said to us. Clearly, it cannot be true. We have to also ask, is there a way of doing black liberation theology, espousing black power, without having to overthrow the money changers in the temple? Based on Biko's analysis that God is not in the habit of coming down from heaven to solve people's problems on earth, it appears vividly that there is no theodicy, and the fact that Cohn postulated that racism is in fact a Christological crisis, and the fact that black power is God's last message to the church. It is clear that revolutionary agency is critical for true Christian faith here in Azania and the world over. But why do we still think that God can do something unique now after the call of black power in Azania and in the world? Unfortunately, here in South Africa, the Mandela mania bamboozled the church, disengaged them from being agents of revolutionary change. The TRC, with its Christian symbolic embellishments, ignored that reconciliation in the true Christian sense comes with a brutal sacrifice. In our case, a bloodied, bruised, whipped, then crucified, pierced, and dangling lifeless body of the black Messiah. This is the gospel for us. Also, it implies that he that has stolen land, stolen bodies and resources, minds and aspirations of the people, must steal no more. Or perhaps repent in a similar fashion as Zacchaeus, who exploited the poor, but his encounter with the not yet bruised and crucified Messiah repented not by mouth, but by deed, through restorative justice as a sign of a contrite heart. Amen. But that has not happened here in Azania. Despite any Christological encounter with the resurrected Messiah, whites and capitalists continue to exploit, lie, and perpetuate injustice against the oppressed through the help of the collaborators and conspirators who stand in our midst. Yeshua, indeed Yeshua, remains for us what Professor Tagazo Mufokeng postulated he is, the crucified amongst the cross bearers. Henry Garnet was correct, yes, in noting that for blacks, it is impossible, like the Israelites, to successfully make a grand exodus from the land of bondage, where the blood-red waters were occupied by pharaohs on both sides of the sea. A classical case and situation from colonialism to immediately neo-colonialism. Our churches have become liturgical institutions and have abandoned the prophetic trajectory. In fact, the rise of the prosperity gospel with its explicit neoliberal and free market capitalist value is a result of the complacency of the church post-1994. People associating the encounter with God to have an existential and material implication. The BC poet, Ikgobele Madungwane, reminds us that late, however, is never a bad start. Azania, here I come from apartheid intact us, in the land of sorrow, from the marathon bondage, the Sharpeville massacre, the flames of Soweto. I was born there. I will die there. In Africa, my beginning, Africa, my ending. Let's do something, Mbopa. Indeed, let us do something, and our latentness does not negate the praxis that is required. To do what we need to do, we have to address again the question of what we mean by being black. What is the implication of blackness? Now, in another, I think there was a newspaper article that was published in 1996, and one of the, I don't know, should I say the title or one of the first introductory sentences of that newspaper article was that Mandela was the first president of the Republic of South Africa who was not white. Now, the choice of words, one might think that our comrades lacked syntax or whatever you want to call it. But it was a deliberate position to assess that he is not a black president for us. He's everything else for everybody, but not for us. And that was very much important for us to say so. And you would remember, with SASO and the Black Consciousness Movement, the question came as to whether, does your position allow you to live with whites? And Biko explained, he says, white people live in this country and they will continue to live in this country. However, they have to live by the rules that are set by the overwhelming majority in this country, who are black people. And Becker's no dear, one of the prophetic white liberals in our own Black Theology and Black Liberation Project. In August, I think, 1977, July 1977, met up with Steve Biko at his house, and he sat with Biko and they spoke. And he says, one of the things I asked and kept on pressing on Biko was to find out as to whether can one day blacks and white work together. And Biko, they say Biko took some time. He pondered about the question. And he said, possibly in the future. But it's imperative that black people do things for themselves, now more than ever. Because for 400 years we've been disengaged from being able to do things for ourselves. It cannot be logical that every time we need to do something, we always have to have too many partners. And in fact, for the Black Consciousness Movement, it was not a problem because the country had already been clearly defined between the whites and the black. The blacks would be your so-called Karat, your so-called Indian, your so-called Bantu. So there was a collective effort on the part of those. The only people that needed to come on board, and they could only come on board if they relinquished power and carry out justice, were the white race. Because ultimately, even for Biko, he raises the issue that our quest as the Black Consciousness Movement is the quest for a true humanity. But he does not locate that true humanity in abstract universalism. He begins first with those that are dehumanized, those that are oppressed, to say they are the symbol that is going to humanize the world. And therefore, in his final analysis, he would say, well, the West has done great in terms of giving us science, mathematics, or whatever you want to call it. However, it remains for Africa to bequeath to the world the greatest gift possible, a humanity with a more humane face. So this is the deep insights in terms of what the Black Consciousness Movement was thinking about. And also the issue of whites, they said, well, if white people want to live South Africa, they can live in South Africa. If white people want to live South Africa, they can live South Africa. That's entirely up to them. It's their choice and not ours. So in order for us to fully grasp what needs to be done, we have to think about the whole idea of what we mean by blackness. How much time do I have? Luckily, I'm not a Baptist preacher. The question of blackness, being black in the world, and black power have been dominant themes, conceptions, and almost a language of articulating aspects that amount to a diagnosis of oppression. While the idea of blackness has been spoken much by the intellectually privileged, who at most reflect a disregard of historical factors in the development of blackness, black power, and being in the world, any articulation of blackness that is not political betrays blackness and can be used as a form of some flat-footed essentialism that does not really help black people to move forward. Now for this, I would have to go to our brother, and I'll say our in the collective sense, Ezra Brown. In the interview he did in 1968, he's asked as to, I think Aldous Griever was running for some official position, and he asked, if a black candidate would run for office, will that make you happy? And Ezra Brown responds, he says, well, even if a black candidate would run for office, black people have to prepare themselves to fight against that person. Mm-hmm. And they ask why. He says, because individuals don't influence people. The system mandates the action of the individual. Yeah. What we want is a change of complete system. Yeah. So it's very much important that we avoid this flat-footed, narrow black nationalism or black essentialism, because it does not really help us with anything. We have been in a situation, of course, we advocate for black theology and black power, but we do know that there are people who maneuver blackness. They will speak about blackness only as it pertains to them. When they say black people are oppressed, they mean they are oppressed because they are not getting the job that they think they deserve. So we don't want that. We want a collective effort that is going to take black people forward as a group.
You can choose to continue till the end, or you can, because we will break. We have a tea break at 12, so it's 11 now. So you still have at least a chunk of your presentation. So say 30 minutes or so.
Okay. The reality of being black is not merely a lens, a grammar, and a tool for descriptive purposes, but it is an eruption into existence of a life that is not predicated or predetermined or contingent on prior points that are assumptions of an expected disposition coming from whites. But blackness is a logical formulation of an active revolt and rebellion against the barometers of a relegated and barricaded existence. While whiteness as a system can be attached to the emergence of blackness, there is a deep quantum reality in blackness that escaped the rigidity of a system of white supremacy, its prying eyes with its so-called intelligence, violence, and agencies. Therefore, whiteness is incapable of predicting blackness, or blackness being a logical and causal consequence of whiteness. It is fundamental to remember that the articulation of blackness stemming from black power meant a turning page in the history of the struggle. Story Carmichael in June 16 pointed out that we want black power because all the scared niggas in Mississippi are dead. In another place he asserted, we will define black power and he, the white man, will listen. Or more importantly, in the Black Panther Party rally for free Huey, Carmichael, as the honorary prime minister of the Black Panther, argued, we came to the United States as black people. It took us 400 years to become Negroes. It was in this rally that Carmichael's stance on blackness attached blackness with the history of being warriors, meaning that we cannot have this black identity without that warrior spirit that is necessary in engaging the enemy. He understood that there was a call for black people in this country to unite, to recognize their heritage, to build a sense of community. It is a call for black people to define their goals, to lead their own organizations. And this is very important because part of how the Black Consciousness Movement comes into being is that there is a breakaway from NUSAS. NUSAS was a white student, integrated student organization, which often wanted to play a leading role in directing the struggles for black people. It would argue certain things and say, but then there was a turning point in Grahamstown. I think it was in 1966 or 67, where you had this big conference of NUSAS. And among the delegates, you had whites, you had blacks, you had all these people. However, because of the apartheid restrictions and past laws and curfews, when a certain time came, these guys were then told that, look guys, it's curfew time, you must now go sleep in the locations, you'll come tomorrow, and we'll continue to really talk about the problems of this country. Now, Biko challenged them. He says, well, if you guys are really honest about wanting to assist us in the fight for liberation, I suggest that we stay here. Yeah. And if we stay here, and the police come to show us how dedicated you are, you should sleep on the floor. The cars must pass through you before they come to us. And once the white students refuse to do that, the end is history. That is the birth of the Black Consciousness Movement. So it was very important that part of the Black Power and the Black Consciousness philosophy was the ability for black people to lead their own organizations. So it's very much important that we understand that. It is significant to note that in the Azanian context, the emergence of SASO, the South African Student Organization, the Black Consciousness Movement, and BPC, and Black Liberation Theology, and the Black People's Project are all under the Black Consciousness philosophy, signifying a move away from white definitions of life, especially the eruption of the dead-like life of the non-white. Black power in Azania, as in most parts of the world, became a rallying cry that was not anticipated by capital and white racists. At first, BC and Black Power were seen by the Boers. Actually, they were convinced at some point that it's a black supremacist organization, which just stood on the borderline of sloganeering. But when they realized that it was a worldwide movement, it became clear that blackness was a category of existence that would shift the gravity between the white ill-begotten wealth, privilege, and exploitation that resulted in the emergence of black people that will take care of business against oppression. Erin Ngenkulu notes that the Boers, after seeing the impact of blackness or defining ourselves as black, decided that at that historical moment, they would give us a name as African people, or as that group which they'd called non-white, seeing that we're rejecting non-white. So they said, well, we're going to come up with a name, and it is said that they kept on delaying in coming with this name. Of course, BC would reject that name on the onset. But at some point, what really sparked the Black Consciousness Movement's anger towards that process was that despite people knowing how we were defining ourselves, they insisted on calling us non-white. So we're told of a story that Steve Biko one day literally woke up and went to one newspaper journalist and editor. And he said to him, "You will accept this term black as defining of us. And you will accept it even if it means that you do so through the barrel of a gun." So it was very clear for the Black Consciousness Movement that this definition is ours, we own it, and we need to live up to it. So despite any attempt that would be made by those to misdirect us, the Black Consciousness Movement was not willing to go that direction because our understanding of blackness is a significant point in time in our history. Therefore, it is here that we must start understanding that black power is a revolutionary force, and anything that is attached to it must be as such. Here, for liberation theory in Azania, we must go back to the basics of a revolutionary identity and focus our blackness for the seizure of power from the pulpit to the state. This can and will be done when there is a rejection of colorblindness and faulty covenantal symbols of a rainbow nation or rainbowism. Given the fact that God sealed his covenant with Noah by using the rainbow as a promise that he will never destroy the world again. But here in Azania, the rainbow nation or rainbowism is a covenant between Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and whites, but not with the overwhelming majority of this country that is black. That is why it is blacks who continue to suffer, despite the stern warning from the Black Consciousness Movement that there must not be any negotiation amongst unequals. Refusal to accept that through the complacency of the church and the false spirit of forgiveness, reconciliation presented in Codesa, the Trojan horse has become indeed a nightmare for the Azanian people. As white ill-begotten wealth and white privilege remains intact, and we have not even begun to be reconciled to the resources of our country. When it comes to black liberation theology, we have realized that there are those, and there are many, who want to airlift black theology from the Black Consciousness Movement, as well as the wave of black power. Now, part of the conversations that we sometimes have is, I suppose, the frustration. If I walk into a classroom as a black liberation theologian that I claim that I am, and you know the conditions that our people are facing, how does one strike a balance between having to teach them this theology that will not really help them with anything and having to go at the core of the problem? Now, I think part of the problem is that when we have these people that airlift things, they airlift theology, they airlift, this and that for the sake of popularity in the academic space or in the media, they create a serious problem because we are not even able to establish true bounds and relations with those who are part and parcel of us as a people. Now, black professors, for instance, and lecturers, they struggle with students, primarily because the student understands the teacher to be fundamentally white. He can never understand or respect you as a black lecturer. Even if you are supposed to say, look, you are being duped here, watch out. They will not have that relationship with you. So at times, and these are some of the conversations we have in courses, to say, what then do we do? Because yes, one can sit and be comfortable in the office, presenting papers and doing all those things. But surely at the core, one should feel like a sellout. Because indeed, there's really nothing that we are doing in the real sense to ensure that something gets done. Now, one has to also observe the generation before of black liberation theologians, who particularly came at that era, who knew that we think and walk with our feet all at the same time. But this has not happened now. And part of the confusion lies in the fact that these ideas are airlifted and so forth and so forth. So there's really a need for us to think about those things and think about them critically. It is impossible, therefore it is impossible and disingenuous to speak about black theology, at least in the academic space, again, without the Black Consciousness Movement. Because the Black Consciousness Movement found it pertinent in South Africa, under the backdrop of colonialism and colonial Christianity, to have an existential reading of the text. And this is the problem, because even in a church setting, in fact, let me tell a story. When there was a course I was teaching, and it was an honors course. So we then touched on the subject of Black liberation theology. I experienced that at University of Johannesburg. I also experienced it now at UP. And all the students, good Christian students, would really have a problem with the content of liberation theology. They would say, no, it can't be so, because there's a deep-seatedness that you don't read the text like this. Some of us have made the argument that, in fact, here in Africa, interpretation precedes reading the text. By the time you read the text, you already know what it means, despite the fact that you've not read it. So that's where the problem, that's the kind of problem that we have. So it's important that we make sure that there is that existential reading of the text. More so in a country that, by political impulse and experience, is largely Christian within the dynamic of color divides and the approach to the divine. Biko expressed the following: Black theology, therefore, is a situational interpretation of Christianity. It seeks to relate the present-day black man's God within the given context of the black man's suffering and his attempts to get out of that suffering. So it's of absolute importance that we maintain the balance between that which is revealed to us in Scripture and that which Scripture tells us to do in our society. Biko and Cohn pointed out that God is a fighting God and a God of the oppressed. A fighting God is therefore not in need of pacifists during a war. The divine omnibenevolence, love, or magnanimity of a deity is reflected in the deity's response to human suffering, particularly the oppressed, the least of these. Unlike the Western response to suffering and the idea of God, Biko did not resolve to atheism, as well as other members of the Black consciousness movement. Instead, concluded to the Black ministry that God is not an accent of divine phenomena to save the oppressed by pathological descent now and again, but instead God seeks to empower the agents that are going to be able to overthrow those that are the oppressors. He empowers his prophets and the oppressed. This is the symbol of God's omnibenevolent, omniscient, enigmatic force and love. God's propensity in the biblical text is geared towards fighting for the oppressed. Biko expressed an existential meaning to Christology, especially in the Black consciousness and Black theology, by expressing the Roman occupation of Israel with the temple changers, as well as the Son of Man's response to the sacrilegious practice of the oppressor, exchanging foreign Roman coinage in his father's temple. Biko sees Yeshua as a fighting God in both the religious as well as the political sense. So inasmuch as we want to get rid of the blending of the priestly and the prophetic, we just cannot do without. They always go together. The vivid view of Black theology and Black consciousness is a formidable tool of analysis in historic and post-apartheid South Africa. The foreign occupation of land, the plunder of resources, and the development of banks and currencies which helped to fuel the development of Western civilization, tandem with abject poverty and devastation of the oppressed. Both Black theology and Black consciousness saw capitalism and race as sacred religious practices in the Black world, undermining culture, changing worldviews, and continuing to set the albatross of cultural and economic bondage. It is important to point out that there is no Black theology again without Black power and the Black power movement, for both of us, here in Tanzania as well as in the United States. Stolika Michael argued, the Black power movement has been the catalyst for bringing together these young bloods, the real revolutionary proletariat, ready to fight by any means necessary for the liberation of our people. In exposing the extent of racism and exploitation which permeates all institutions in the United States, the Black Power movement has unique appeal to young Black students on campuses across the country. These students have been deluded by the fiction that exists in white North America, that if the Black man would educate himself and behave himself, he would be acceptable enough to leave the ranks of the oppressed and join white society. This year, when provoked by the savage white policemen, students on many campuses fought back. Whereas before they had accepted these incidences without rebellion. As students are a part of these rebellions, they begin to acquire a resistance consciousness. They begin to realize that white North America might let every few of them escape one by one into the mainstream of a society. But as soon as blacks move in concert around their blackness, she will reply with a fury which reveals her true racist nature. And one can also comment on this, that the Black Consciousness movement also had a similar view. Part of it was that SASO operated from the premise that we're all for education. We understand education as the accumulation of knowledge, one. Two, knowledge that may or may not be used in the world. So it was very much important that we understand our role. And that's why we're in a very awkward situation where the likes of Unkgopotse-Tiro, one of the BC giants, was actually expelled on graduation day. The certificate had been printed, everything was fine, then they gave him the podium as the president of the SRC to speak. And one of the things he said, well, unless your education is linked to the plight of Africa and the continent at large, then your education is meaningless and useless. He was expelled, and subsequent to that, he was later bombed in Botswana, a student leader, who, having gone through the phase of being a student and now being credentialized, turned around the system. And one can only think of, what's his name, Cornel West, that there's a difference between education and credentialization. And we have to think about that. The Black Consciousness movement stresses the solidarity of blacks, as well as the Black Consciousness movement and the Black Power stresses the solidarity of blacks in response to the devastation and oppression that is imposed or was imposed on us. The Black Consciousness movement had their own Hegelian reading of the situation in South Africa. It proposed as a thesis that the problem is white racism. The antithesis, therefore, would be black solidarity. And ultimately, we're going to move to the phase of liberation to present a just and egalitarian society. And one has to say here, because some people might say, well, what about integration? I think our Black Messiah, Brother Malcolm, put it very nicely, that we can't compromise on the liberation just to integrate, to drink coffee with whites. That's a terrible price to pay. But nonetheless, Biko was asked on the question of integration. He says, well, integration, based on the SASO document, integration will not be imposed or worked for. That was the first thing. It must not be imposed, it must not be worked for. Integration should only take place when all the doors of prejudice are closed. Then integration will take place automatically. But it must not be imposed on us. And unfortunately, here in Azania and perhaps in the US, it has been imposed. And that is why you realize that if it has been imposed and you have to work for it, how do you do so when the doors of injustice are still open? How do you do that when basically the system of yesterday remains intact and nothing has actually changed? So it was very much important that for them, this is the approach that should be taken. So a very strong insistence on black solidarity. As students, the SASO understood that the political reality circumscribes the recognition of being black. As SASO would express it through and through, we are black before we're students. The role of education in order to filter through to white society and the working force are artificial labels that seek to mute the oppressed from voicing out their discontent with the system and their ability to change the system. Now, it's very interesting that part of what the Black Consciousness movement expressed was that there's a need for self-determination and self-reliance. Now, Harry Nyankuli, during the Fees Must Fall period, came to address us at UNISA. And I remember the students were on his neck that said, look, you guys are from SASO, you are BC guys, look at what the universities are doing to us and what. And Hlulani Mdingi says, no, you guys are the petty bourgeoisie class. That's the problem. It says, because us as SASO, we have long dealt with the issue. We said we are black before we were students. So anything else that happens to us, we understand it to be fundamentally linked to the fact that we are black. Yes. And in fact, by 1973, a newspaper article appeared. The Black Consciousness Movement had already started to build a university for itself. So you can imagine the kind of tenacity, the kind of courage that this philosophy gave to our people, the ability to really take care of their own business, So it's very much important that we remember that, and perhaps even us at some point, we might be working in the institutions only to work ourselves out of the institutions. So I don't tell you to do that. You do that on your own. Biko stressed the danger also of liberal politics and the projected image of this humanistic worldview of integration, judging precisely as Carmichael has saw it, that it's an act of political maneuvering and creating the petty bourgeoisie group oblivious to the existential and historical processes of the oppressed. The same group that goes or not goes to church on Sunday is the same group that expects or don't expect miracles from God. But Biko expressed that black consciousness as the motive, expressed that the black consciousness movement and philosophy was the most positive call to come out of the black world or the third world in a very long time. This meant that the trajectory of black consciousness was a broad response to global oppression of people of color, a spiral grip by the matrix of race and class divides. Sedman, discussing black power, which transcends national borders, noted that Carmichael popularized the term black power, which made him a household name. He was also a main proponent of conceptualizing black communities in the United States as internal colonies. He attended the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London in 1967, where he joined Heaven Marcuse's C.L.R. James and other critical theories, political activists, and countercultural figures to discuss new ways in which intellectuals might act to change the world and create a revolutionary consciousness, declaring at London conference that black power to us means that black people see themselves as part of a new force, something called the Third World. Carmichael tied the struggle of the global South to the very definition of black power. Blackness within the political and philosophical spectrum carries then this international and universal decry of exploitation and fixation of existence of alive and pigmented bodies living around these parameters that have been set by whiteness. Black power facilitated the conveyor belt politically, or facilitated this conveyor belt effect that would lead us into understanding the evolution of ideas and the importance of those ideas when it comes to praxis. It's a humanity that embodies a new civilization against white or Western civilization. Black power sees Western civilization as a failed system, embroiled in barbarism and savagery. Solidarity of the oppressed groups are also part of this rebellion and this new civilization that we attempt to build. Now, as part of his trip in the Third World, Story Carmichael asserted that when greeting the Cuban, we greet you as comrades because it becomes increasingly clear to us each day that we share with you a common struggle. We have a common enemy. Our enemy is white Western imperialist society. Note that we use the term white Western society as opposed to Western civilization. The West has never been civilized. It has no right to speak of itself as civilized. Our struggle is to overthrow the system which feeds itself and expands itself through the economic and cultural exploitation of the so-called non-white and non-European peoples of the Third World. We share with you also a common vision of an establishment of this humanistic society in place of those that are now existing. We seek with you the change on the power basis of the world, where mankind will share the resources of their nations instead of having to give them up to foreign plunders, where civilizations can retain their cultural sovereignty instead of being forced to submit to foreign rulers who impose their own corrupt culture on those civilizations they would dominate. Similarly, Comrade Hlulani Mdingi argued on the question of civilization, what we here in this country fail to recognize is that the entire notion of civilization actually comes out of Africa. From mathematics, from the concept of the zero, the Middle Eastern religions, and actually religions that come out of Africa. The notion of monotheism comes out of Africa. And these are things we are not being taught. Our children are not being taught that. What our children are being taught is that everything that is said to be civilized comes from Europe or comes from America. Even those of us who claim to be revolutionaries, when we talk of socialism, we jump to the conclusion that socialism was born in Europe and that it is another lie. Because what African people don't recognize is that African societies, before whites came onto African continent, lived as socialists. So these are kinds of messages that we need to be sending out to our people. But unfortunately, the message that is being sent to our people via the newspaper and television and other media outlets are messages that are coming out from Europe and represent their agenda. What Hlulani Mdingi as well as Carmichael affirm is our power misleads the oppressed and replaces history as well as political development. Now today I had an interview in the morning with a radio station because on Monday, on the 21st, we are celebrating, or they are celebrating Human Rights Day. On our side, we are commemorating the Sharpeville massacre. And part of the question I was asked is, why do you guys insist that this day should be called Heroes Day? And we said, because we don't want our people to forget. Part of it is that we've never fought for human rights. We've always known, black people have always known that they're human. It's only whites who didn't know. Yes. So we can't be endorsing what they want us to endorse. Yes. And part of it is that our people on that particular day demonstrated the courage and the strength to engage a system. It was a peaceful march, but the system responded, as they always do, mercilessly. But from our side, we don't want to repeat that because we believe in one principle, that memory is the privilege of the living. So if we cannot maintain that, then we are not willing to do anything else. What black theology and black consciousness brings to the forefront is the question of a humanity, a lost humanity, which must be attained. The person of Christ, the incarnation of God in physiological substance and in existential time and history, reveals a face to this enigmatic God who is revealed among the lowly and the oppressed. Now, I once challenged my students when we were doing the Trinity, when we were studying the doctrine of the Trinity, and I said, well, we do take into account that Jesus has come in the flesh. God has come in the flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. So I then said, now tell me, when he transcended or when he went to heaven, what happened to the body? And I think the students were just not willing to think that for them, he probably left the body somewhere. I said, no. If he leaves the body somewhere, then it nullifies what he has done. Because we know that when he comes, we'll have to identify him. So they said, no, where are you going with this? I said, well, if we were to read the book of Revelation, and when we read the book of Revelation, there's a strong insistence by the 24 elders when they refer to the Lamb, that he that has been slain, he that has been slain. I said the point is very simple, that this God who is going to come, who is going to be identified with wounds and scars and all, is still in solidarity with the oppressed. He was crucified by the Roman authority. Those are markers to say he is with us as the oppressed. So of course, students would not, they thought I was preaching a different gospel. But I think this is the importance of us understanding the implication of God coming in the flesh. And black theology seeks to make that point, to blend both this so-called revelation and the agency that is linked to it, which we cannot separate as long as human suffering is part and parcel and the parousia has not come. So black theology and black consciousness therefore reveals the valid distinctions between the only begotten of the Father, the divine presence from all eternity, the second person of the Trinity, in contrast to white, ill-begotten wealth. coupled with our looming rejection of Western systems. Who can forget, and my apologies to the Anglican guys, I heard there's an Anglican. Who can forget that the Church of England was located above the male slave dungeons in the Cape Coast? Who can forget that as they preached, just below them, slaves were experiencing misery? One tour guide puts it to us. He says, well, you know, part of it is that you could not pass going to church without you being influenced or you having to smell what came underneath. But yet they continued to worship. Despite that, and even worse, we have come to learn that actually they were led by a black preacher who had been taught in the United States. So how can we forget these things, because they are very much important. It is said that those who were in the dungeon knew what was going on above, and those above knew what was going on below. Similarly, it has been noted that the God of the slaves below the slave ship, who were packed like sardines, was not the God of the master above in the slave ship. Similarly, the God of white churches and Western society is not the God of the oppressed. The ill-begotten wealth and supremacy of white sees itself in Christological terms. Just as Christ is drawn from all eternity into physical manifestation of the existential, whiteness and Western capitalist class structure predicates itself on a similar status of being perennially rulers of the world. We must do something about it. The colonial gospel of bondage uses the person of Christ as a divine mandate to get the access of privilege for the oppressor. And they also introduced, in some sense, a divine form of racism, which we must reject, at least when we follow Cone and Biko. Cone and Biko have made the person of Christ as the only begotten of the Father, imbued with liberation and political participation as part of his essence and his substance. Cone touches the issue of black Christianity as well as with the Marxist reading into the divine and existential, pointing out why we've got a friend, to a certain extent, in the Marxist tool of analysis. The use of race and class in the person of Christ and in the question of black humanity is an invitation to divine solidarity and the true face of individuality. The individuality that is bound by the binary of being deeply entrenched in the identity of the community itself. Kalowski correctly pointed out that as man is endowed with humanity by nature, compulsion to join in the community is not a violation of the individual's freedom, but a release from the prison of one's own ignorance. The role of Christ within black consciousness movement, the black power movement, at least as understood in South Africa, the revelation of God as black power and black liberation theology are valid in discussions of class and race. The Roman occupation of Israel and the money changers in the temple results in a zealous response from the Son of Man concerning the sacred religious practice by the oppressor. This view accounts to the fact that God, when it comes to the oppressed, those who are oppressed by race, those who are oppressed by class, God will always empower us to overturn the temples of the money changers. The black experience, while imploded by racial oppression and the evolutionary roles that white society has given to us, from savage to subhuman to slave and so-called the working class, we cannot escape the reality that we are oppressed also because of the deep economic plunder that is the primary game of colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and anything else. It advances because such systems advances economic system which Europeans seek to impose on those they oppress. Simultaneously, it gives financial backing to the enforcers who enforce the law, at the same time claiming that they are developing us, they are modernizing us, as well as a cultural preference that they want to impose on the oppressed. Therefore, there's a need for this awakening. An awakening to see the reality beyond preservation of culture or past, with serious economic development that makes us to observe the importance of our class categories in our current situation, as well as the future that we would like to to inhabit. Now, also as part of Story Carmichael's trip, it's pointed out that in the summer of 1967, the Black Freedom Movement activist Story Carmichael and Cuban leader Fidel Castro captured worldwide attention as they denounced racism from the shores of Cuba. They pointed out, because our color has been used as a weapon to oppress us, we must use our color as a weapon of liberation. Stokely and Castro are rejecting the deplorable nature of white supremacy and the role of playing God by white society. In Black consciousness, theology becomes a hermeneutic into both the visible and the invisible world. While Black consciousness finds the God of the oppressed in Black theology, Black consciousness also achieves a form of liberation not anticipated by the system in naming ourselves. This aspect pertains to our psychological liberation from a false consciousness that has been imposed on us. Biko and Story Carmichael defined Black power and consciousness and Black consciousness as, firstly, a psychological struggle which is meant to direct us politically and lead us into a different trajectory that we would take. Now, as a way of concluding, I think we have to think that there is a serious crisis in the intelligentsia. I've never particularly had friends who are academics. I think Lerato is the first. Most of the time, my friends are maybe people who have not even finished school or whatever the reason. But I judge the success of what I do on the basis of how they respond. Now, you can come and tell them about Fanon, they're not interested. You can come and tell them about this and this, because at the end of the day, what's important to them is how you act, is also how you play a particular role in a given society. Now, most of our schools here in Azania, you hardly come across an intellectual. In fact, an intellectual is something that you're probably going to meet at university. So on that level, there's really nothing to aspire to be like. So I think the aim on the main is that I would not want, I think how I view myself, and this is just my personal view, I think when you go around shoving it down people's throat that you've got a PhD and you are Black and you don't have land, you really have a serious problem. Because I think ultimately the measure of our intelligence should not be the credentials we have. It's whether we are able with what we have to transform our society, to engage the enemy in our society. If, for instance, in the animal kingdom they survive by instinct, then surely our intelligence is our intent. One Azania, one nation.
So we can engage, ask questions.
There's a request because it's almost 12. Okay. So there's a request whether we should have coffee quickly and then. But there's one question quickly, then we take a tip.
Just one quick question, a 5-second comment, and a 3-second question. So the comment is first, so I noticed when you come in, you were playing Dr. Mdingi from Cairo to Cape Town. Was that deliberate?
Was what?
When we came in?
Or Cape to Cairo, that's all.
Yeah, about Dr. Mdingi, because it's going to foreground my question.
Yeah, no, that's a struggle solved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to foreground my question by that. So I noticed that you were playing Dr. Mdingi from Cairo to Cape Town, and you were talking about Black solidarity and liberal theology. And much of what you were presenting highlighted the significance of many African American scholars and theologians and the impact. But many of us, we're more interested in what African theologians have to say. And so we're appreciative that Cone and so many others have had a tremendous impact on theologizing in here in Africa. But for many of us, it's more important to us what African scholars are saying.
Yeah. I think part of the, I don't know if we discussed this, you know, the biggest mistake, well, it's not a mistake, I suppose it's, I don't know what to call it, I'll just leave it as that. But what has happened is that in the South African context, and I highlight this because at some point also Cone touches on it, there is an understanding. Here in Azania, you must make two distinctions. There's what we call African theology, and there's what we call Black liberation theology. Yeah. Black liberation theology is political. African theology wants to tell us about African culture. Now we're saying, no, that's all fine and good, but does that advance the agenda of the revolution? Mm-hmm. So that's where you see that there's a sort of like a distinction. If maybe, for instance, you could pick up some of the works that are written by Alan Dusak, you are going to see that, in fact, he's going back to the trajectory of a revolutionary response that is necessary in this country. So at times, and this is part of our own frustration, is that our theologians, it's either they are going to affirm what the system is saying, or if they go the route of African theology, they'll tell us about how Africa was so great, and so, but we don't want to hear that. What we want to hear is how do we tilt the scale, how do we seize power and remove those who are at the top to ensure that we bring about the society that we want. And that is why, for instance, in fact, with African theology, it's a project of white liberals who then coerce African scholars to come in, be part and parcel of that. So at some point, us as being young academics, we reject that. Well, we're not going to jive with that. We insist that what we want is a revolution. And if we take that route, we have no other route except to go to Black liberation theologians such as Tinyiko, what you call, not Tinyiko, Itumeleng Musala. We have to engage Mutabi. We have to engage Takaso Mufuke. Because at the end of the day, they too are not only part of the conversation here in Azania, but in fact the conversation across the board between the United States and Africa. If you look at the Journal for Black Theology, in fact you will see the interesting dialogue that happens between the global north as well as the south. And there's a good mending, a good relationship that is there which advances the revolution. In fact, some of the people who published in that journal were part of the political leaders at the time who were advancing for revolution. So far, I can safely say that it's either the young generation of Black theologians have to reinvent themselves, or they just have to follow the circus.
You sparked my curiosity, my anxiety in so many different ways. When you link the necessity of Black consciousness movement and Black liberation theology revolution together, you reminded me of some of our experiences of how the processes of what we say and what we do need to come together. In my personal experience with my peoples, our peoples of Latin America, the role of education as the process of conscientization that will be bridging that in the daily lives, right? When you said we need to blacken our relationships, our structures, our kindness, our gentleness, even if we look like fools in the face of others that do not recognize our resistance by saying no to unkindness, by saying no to. So, and you mentioned education, and you went to. So, I'm curious how the education as Black conscientization is happening. How's that been played?
Well, to tell you the honest truth, I think education here in Azania remains to play the role that it has always played. The so-called academic would be proud. They write books, they write articles, and even worse, we're not saying they shouldn't. If you want to write books, you want to do, it's all fair and good. If you want to buy yourself a house in the suburb, it's all fair and good. But be linked to the black community. Be able to do certain things in the black community. Now, that's why I said for many of us, we grew up, we don't even know what an intellectual looks like. In fact, the likelihood is that if you come to the black community as an intellectual with your petty bourgeoisie appetites, the likelihood that they're going to rob you because you don't even know the culture and everything else. So now, this year, for instance, we had a situation where they were celebrating the achievements of the matriculates. So some of us wrote a statement to say, well, we're not happy because the educational system in South Africa does not have serious pedagogical outcomes. It's about people getting their certificate to access university and so forth. But on the main, education is supposed to transform society. Yes. But our education is structured in a way that it should not transform society. It's for upward mobility. Now the problem then comes with the black intelligentsia. What is the role of the black intelligentsia? And that's where we have a serious crisis because the black intelligentsia wants to sleep on both sides. When it's with whites, it wants to say, oh, black people are oppressed. When it's with blacks, oh, you guys don't know nothing. I'm an expert. You should know what I'm talking about. Or I know what I'm talking about. So that is where we have to, that's why I said, for me personally, I know when white society, so, oh, this is Dr. Mdingi. In my heart, I say, but I don't have land. You see? I don't have land, and I don't think I have the capacity to take it because of me being proud of my PhD or stuff like that. We have to have the ability. I'll make an example with SASO, the Black Consciousness Movement. When they said education is the accumulation of knowledge, one, knowledge that may or may not be used in the world. They tell a story. We had what you traditionally call your bush universities. These bush universities would be later known as the black, what you call university when the Black Consciousness Movement comes into space. So they tell us a story. They say, well, when the Boers would come in a bush university, they would come with their tanks and tear gas and all those things. And you had comrades in that fold who came from various different academic disciplines. Some came from the sciences, some came from the humanities, what you had a range of these guys that came from these various academic disciplines. And then the Boers would come, ruffle up the students a bit. At some point, they will then disengage or discharge a tear gas, and it will be a state of absolute pandemonium in that university. But then they would do the same thing in what you would know as white-only universities. But you know what is the strange thing? The minute they discharge that tear gas and it emits the smoke, the comrade who's also a student of chemistry quickly responds. So you see the distinction. Ours don't respond. Because somewhere your education is not related to concrete reality, even though tomorrow you might claim to be a specialist. So even today, we're not educated to go better the black community. It's not what we're being educated for. We're being educated for upward mobility. When I sit at my apartment looking outside, the blue skies, the trees, I think, oh man, I've done it. Yeah. But I missed the point that what we need to do is to transform the whole of society. Yes. And in order for us to be able to do that, we have to commit ourselves to certain things. And if we don't commit ourselves to those things, then the whole task is useless at the end of the day. So in essence, what I can say is that our education remains as is. You can even think now, you know, they allowed us, I don't think they endorsed it, they allowed us to talk about Africanization. They allowed us to talk about indigenization. They allowed us to talk about decolonization. And none of us posed a minute and said, what does this mean? You think the curriculum of decolonization, if it is to be pursued in an academic university, the university will remain the same? So if they are willing to allow us to do this, clearly they've got a plan for us. And they know that we are going to do this simply to be an intellectual exercise. But to really decolonize the university, how do you decolonize the university when you don't decolonize society?